Hello and welcome to the Indie Beginning Podcast. It is our mission to bring readers and authors together through reviews, discussion, and unique topic episodes inspired by the author or their work. This week's episode is brought to you by Shirts by Sarah. Head over to shirtsbysarah.com to find the shirt that tells your story. Remember to subscribe to the podcast to keep up to date with the stories and the discussions. This week, Marie Kammerer Franke will narrate the beginning of the Sangrook Saga by Steve Thomas, a dark fantasy tale that follows the morbid history of the Sangrook clan. Are the Sangrooks necromancers? Demon worshippers? Just deranged torturers? Or are they all of that and more? Turn the lights down and allow Marie Kammerer Franke to introduce you to the Sangrook Saga.
The Pact. The Convergence realized all too late that Sangrook's power thinned as the clan grew larger. Ironically, had they left us alone, our magic would have dwindled away and our empire would have collapsed on its own. The purge only made its survivors stronger. I intend to survive. From Orkael Sangrook's journal. This is a fine sword, Orkael mused as he lifted it from the young Prince Kallimir's broken hand. The boy lay sprawled across the floorboards, his vine velvet shirt in tatters, his buckskin pants torn to reveal bruised skin. Orkael folded his arms and leaned against the wall, watching as Braxam delivered a kick to the boy's side for good measure. Good craftsmanship, excellent balance, and do I detect an infusion of some kind? It's not every day someone comes at me with a magic blade. The defeated prince lifted a quivering head and spat blood and spite at Orkael, splattering his shoes. "You'll never beat me, necromancer," he said, his voice as weak as his body. Orkael Sangrook tutted. "Oh, I think I already have." He tossed the sword aside. "Braxam, would you find a place to display the Kallimir family sword? I'm sure our guests would be most distraught to imagine that their family heirloom was poorly attended after their deaths." Braxam grunted and pushed off from the stone wall, stepping toward the sword. His brother had a penchant for the theatrical. He loved to play with his victims, to let their defeat linger. It was a bad habit. The boy would try another attack, and Orkael, gloating, would only serve an opening. He glanced back at Princess Agara Kammerer, the young prince's sister. The woman hung from the ceiling by chains and manacles, her toes just barely grazing the floor. Blood trickled down her bare chest, oozing from the ruins and the glyphs carved into her flesh, dripping from the tips of her breasts down to the tattered blouse draped over her hips, staining her paisley skirts. Despite the kidnapping, despite the torture, and despite the blood rituals, she still held her head high and met his eyes with defiance. She was a noble woman, to the bitter end. Or so she thought. There would be plenty of time to break Agara. For a few moments longer, dealing with her brother was more urgent. Orkael paced beside the young man, stopping now and then for a swift kick. "I bet you fancied yourself the heroic prince come to save his sister from the evil necromancer." Kick. "You'd walk in here and what? The converged god would descend and imbue you with some holy might, and you'd cast me and my brother into unbound realm?" Kick, kick. "You thought you'd rescue your sister and take her back home, tell a few stories and get great deeds. Maybe your father would open some prized bottle of wine in your honor." Kick. "Let me show you how this plays out." Orkael dropped one knee. He grabbed the crumpled boy by the head and spun his broken body around. The prince was groaning, quivering rag doll in Orkael's grasp. The necromancer caught the boy in a headlock, squeezing his throat with spiteful arm, and lifted his head, speaking directly into his ear. "Look at your sister. I want you to see. We were very nearly finished with her when you arrived. Would you care to watch the rest?" The young prince could only groan. His face was already turning from red to blue. "Braxam, why don't you continue the ritual? He was kind enough to supply a blade after all." Braxam nodded. Kallimir's eyes were already glazing over, and his gaze was unsteady. He wouldn't have watched for long. Algahara, on the other hand, would be fully alert. Braxam snatched up the sword and returned to the chained princess. Still she struggled to put on a brave face. But the facade was cracked. Her brown eyes were dripping with fear. She winced as the tip of the sword broke the skin beneath her collarbone, but she did not scream. Braxam heard a thump from behind. He spun to see Orcael was staggering backwards, and the Prince Kammerer had rolled onto his back. The boy had somehow rallied the strength to headbutt the necromancer and break his grip. Orcael appeared to be uninjured, but his demeanor grew tense and angry. "I would have let you two say your goodbyes," he said, and then stretched his hands in front of his chest. He turned his palms until they faced each other. A thin line of crimson energy arced between them, and Orcael slipped that magical garrow around Kammerer's throat. With a swift jerk, Prince Kammerer's head dropped to the ground. His body soon followed. Orcael grunted and kicked the head across the room. "He ruined it!" "You take too much pleasure in torturing them," said Braxam. "I've told you before how dangerous it is." "It's not about killing them. I could have killed him 10 different ways before he got through the door." Agahara was sobbing now, her tears leaving streaks in the dried blood on her face. "I wanted him to die hopeless and terrified, so when I brought him back... It doesn't matter now. Clean this up." He straightened his collar and buttoned his sleeves, then skulked toward the door that led upstairs, waving dismissingly at the girl. "I'll finish with her later. No one else should be coming to interrupt today." The door slammed shut behind him, leaving Braxam alone with Agahara in the dungeon. The building was an old guardhouse in the middle of a forest, built in ancient times when some forgotten empire sprawled across the land. With the help of some spells to clear out the errant foliage and to convert some builders into thralls, Orcael made a place habitable again. Braxam's only contribution had been nailing down a few floorboards to seal away the dead thralls once the rest of the work had been completed. Braxam stood in what once had been a guard's post. He envisioned a desk or a bookshelf in the corner where Agahara now hung. There was a fireplace to one side of that corner and a stairwell on the other. Perhaps the table at the center of the room was where the guards ate, drank, and gambled to while away their shifts. The cells were down the hallway. Orcael had left them just as he had found them. He liked the aesthetic of dripping mold and crawling roots. Anything to remind his prisoners of their hopeless situation. He tried not to think about the thralls locked away in that hall, slowly starving to death, only leaving their cells when Orcael needed a test subject, only eating when another prisoner died. They'd eat tonight at least. Braxam hoisted the late Prince Kammerer's decapitated body onto the table. Orcael wasn't the only one who needed test subjects. Braxam slid the Kammerer sword under his belt and instead drew a small, obsidian razor. This was his favorite tool for magic. A blackstone capable of biting into flesh with a sharp, shallow, and most of all, precise cuts. He never liked to draw more blood than necessary, and his left arm was already a web of scars. He balled his left fist and prepared to cut into his forearm. "What are you going to do to him?" Agahara's voice was soft, but it still carried authority of a princess. Braxam sighed. He hated talking about the brutal work he did at his brother's behest. It never seemed reasonable when he tried to say it out loud. "I can't have the body laying around. Our prisoners need to eat. Do I need to go on?" She held back a sob and tears welled in her green eyes. No. She sucked in a deep breath and raised her head as if she were haggling with the street merchant rather than hanging half-naked from a ceiling with a spell carved into her chest. "May I at least say goodbye to my brother? You owe me that much after all you've done." Braxton sheathed his razor, then retrieved the head. It was already pale and had picked up some dust rolling across the floor. Braxam held Prince Kammerer by his brown hair and brought the lifeless eyes and dangling jaw to meet Agahara's face. "Alone," she said. Braxam couldn't help but be swayed by her audacity, speaking as if she had any power left. "As you wish, my lady." He rested Agahara's dead brother's head at her feet and started up the stairs, chuckling at her spirit. Upstairs, Orcael sat at the great oak table built to seat a dozen men. He was gaunt and pale from his frequent use of magic, and his eyes were bloodshot from forsaking sleep. He hunched over a half-eaten bowl of root and herb stew, wrapped in a blanket and calmly sipping tea. Orcael only ate the simplest of foods, claiming that anything else would distract him from his work. Braxam took a seat, but didn't reach for the bread. He was expected to procure his own food. "Kind of the boy to come to us," said Braxam. "But why kill him so soon?" Archael waved the question away. He didn't matter. I thought the goal was to dominate everyone else who shared our blood, not just the women. Different mothers. It was only the girl's mother, the king's first wife, who I could trace to Sangrook. He slurped down the last mouthful of tea and set the cup down. You should soulbind with me. His voice was cool and gruff now, lacking the passionate bravado he had used while reveling in his defeat of Prince Kammerer. We can draw on each other's strength to speed up our plan. Loan me some of your strength, and I can help you reach new heights of magic. Braxton knew all too well who would benefit more from that arrangement. Soulbinding created a spiritual link between people, but it was never a partnership of equals. Archael was wearing his body thin with reckless use of magic. He had drawn power from the pact to handily defeat Prince Kammerer. But once that power faded, he would be left weaker and more decrepit than before, as if he'd traded 2 years of his life to win the fight. With soulbinding, he could take strength from Braxam and give Braxam the same ability, to run himself into an early grave doing his brother's bidding. That was hardly a mutually beneficial arrangement. Braxam shook his head. No, I'm still not ready for that. Archael scoffed, and a tick in his eyebrow further expressed the annoyance. I have work to do. I need to finish with the girl and move on. We've attracted too much attention here. Don't disturb us. He stood, his chair creaking as it slid across the floor, then returned to the basement, leaving Braxton to entertain himself. He waited until he heard the first scream from the dungeon, then slipped outside. He sloshed his way through the insect-ridden marsh, refusing to draw on the pack to ease his passage through the dense mud. This place had been a village once, but as the story goes, it was flooded by an earthquake and abandoned. Braxam didn't know whether to believe that rumor, but he did know that the only people who chose to live in the swamp were outlaws, exiles, and hermits. After an hour of walking through the bog and over roughly hewed boardwalks, Braxam climbed the granite steps of a temple marked with 4 roses arranged in a diamond, the sigil of some long-dead god. Each rose was taller than a man and forged of copper, now bright green with corrosion, bolted to the brick wall above the faded oaken double door. He shouldered his way through the stiff doors and ignored their grating, plaintive squeals. Inside, he stood in an antechamber floored with frayed carpets. Ivory crept through the windows, and the stench of animal urine hung in the air. You've been here a year, Almondo, Braxam muttered to himself. Clean the place up a bit. He passed into the sanctuary. The open sky greeted him through a collapsed roof, and he tread lightly over fallen rafters and chandeliers, over the puddles and the saplings as he made his way to the doorway beyond. This brought him to a long and musty hallway leading to many rooms, only one of which had a door. Braxam knocked. Almondo, I need advice. He was met with silence, then slow, shuffling footsteps. The door creaked open to reveal a wrinkled man with white hair, garbed in a faded brown rough-spun tunic that hung to his knees. His only other article of clothing was a robe belt tied around his waist with a nail piercing each end, which marked him as a penitent pilgrim. Almondo was more than that, though. He had once been a priest at the converged god, but was defrocked for attempting to soulbind animals. Or so Almondo said. Everyone in this swamp had a story. This far from convergence territory, it would be hard to pose as a priest just by wearing humble clothes and speaking in a vaguely religious aphorisms. On the other hand, if a man spent a year of his life as a hermit in the ruins of a temple, doling out spiritual advice to any wretch who came his way, who was to say he didn't deserve to call himself one? Almondo flashed a weary smile. How can I help you, my son? He waved Braxam through the door and into the only well-preserved room in this old church. It was Almondo's study. A great wooden table sat in the center of the room, surrounded by chairs and coated in candle wax. Almondo's usual chair was at the far end, though the whole table was dotted with burning candles. The walls were lined with bookshelves, and what books and scrolls remained were only somewhat musty. Almondo's bed was in the far corner, a humble straw pallet topped with a wool blanket. Braxam took a seat. It's my brother. He has another prisoner, a noblewoman. Almondo snatched a decanter and 2 cups from a cabinet. The King's of Widmer's daughter? I've heard rumors that she went missing. He poured himself a glass. Braxam nodded. And we killed her oldest brother. The priest pushed a cup towards him, but Braxam waved it away. You know I don't drink. You're too afraid of the pact, Almondo said with a smile. That's not to say you should be careless with it, but a glass of weak wine now and then shouldn't enable too many unholy atrocities. A bit of regret flashed over his face. He took the cup back. A poor joke. Forgive me. Exile makes a man go a bit cynical, especially after being cast out of the convergence. Braxam shrugged it off. He had more important problems than a priest's sense of humor. You said you'd help me release my brother from the pact. I can't wait much longer. We'll be moving on soon, before the king sends an army into the swamp. It won't be long, now that we've relieved him of 2 children. I'm still working on it. I've sent out a few locals in search of the books I need, but they won't be back for months, if they find the books at all. You can't trust the scum that live out here, said Braxam. Almondo raised an eyebrow and chuckled. Braxam continued. I thought you said you could sneak back into the convergence. I've made some progress, but the knowledge you're after is above my rank. I can't go rooting around in Lord Crusader's head, now can I? I can barely read it into a low-ranking monk without detection. Now, I've planted some inappropriate curiosities and a few acolytes, and you can always count on their sort of sneak into the forbidden scriptures. But I can only glean so much information through convergence. They're still watching for me. Braxam shook his head. That's not going to be fast enough either. How much time do you think you have? Days, said Braxam. She's resisting. I've never seen someone fight so hard against soul binding, but she can't last forever. The king's first wife had a strong Sangrook blood, perhaps on par with yours. The pact doesn't work like convergence. The converged god believes in cooperation and willing participation, a worldwide collective in total harmony and all that, until someone gets branded a heretic. The Sangrook pact was something older and darker. It operates in subjugation and dominance. We still don't know what's at the top of the hierarchy, but it's something even the converged god is afraid of. Braxam knew how the story ended. He heard it dozens of times, both from Almondo and Orcael. The Sangrooks fell, in part because they bred too widely, until the fragments of the pack stopped recognizing each other as parts of the whole. Orcael is trying to collect up all the pieces of the pact and graft them back onto himself. I know all this. What does this have to do with the girl? I suspect that her fragment is trying to defend itself. If her blood runs as thick as yours and Orcael's, perhaps you've met your equal. Braxam considered that. That was why he asked me to soulbind with him again. Almondo pointed at Braxam with his glass. You need to be careful with that. I know. If he gets into my mind, there's no hope of saving him. He'll find out the plan. It's not just that, said Almondo. He views himself as the one true heir of the Sangrook pact, on a quest to prune the family tree. If you think he's going to make an exception for his little brother, you aren't paying attention. Braxam nodded at this and tightened his cloak around his chest. He had seen Orcael's obsession firsthand multiple times. He had watched his brother soulbind and murder 7 Sangrook descendants thus far. He had seen how his obsession grew with each murder, and watched as his brother slowly faded away from him. Braxam was safe only as long as he remained useful. He knew that. He wanted nothing more than to save his brother, to cleanse him of the pact. But he was running out of time. Almondo was his best hope, and the guardhouse wouldn't stay secret much longer. They have to move soon, and if Almondo hadn't found the answer by then. He crossed the room, snatching up a loaf of bread as he passed. I'll be back in a few days. Light a candle in the belfry if you find out anything I can use before then. He left the temple and trudged home through the swamp beneath the full moon. The guardhouse was quiet when Braxam arrived. That meant Orcael was done with Agahara for the night. It was Braxam's duty to clean up the mess after sessions, so he hung up his cloak by the door and descended into the dungeon. Blood was splashed about with Orcael's usual level of sadistic enthusiasm. The girl's blood-soaked dress lay crumpled on the floor of the stairs, her brother's head resting on the table, flapped on its side with eyes pointing at the princess. A woman's finger and clumps of her hair rested alongside an assortment of gory tools, a spiked whip, a hammer, a knife. Orcael had finally succumbed to his frustration with her. Agahara herself hung naked from the wrists, heaving labored breaths. Her right leg was bruised and mangled and bent the wrong way. Her head was bald in spots, and one eye was swollen shut. Her chest was a tangle of overlapping ruins, and her stomach and her back had been scored by the whip. When he turned to her, Agahara sucked in one breath and struggled to compose herself, to display that defiant strength she had projected earlier. But she cracked almost immediately. She strained and wheezed as her lungs pressed against broken ribs. Agahara struggled to straighten her back and to balance on one foot with her arms chained to the ceiling. Braxton pulled up a chair in front of the woman. "Those are some serious wounds," he said. "Fatal, I'd say. I should probably be cleaning up and sharpening the knives, but let's have a discussion. You see, I know my brother wants you to soulbind with him, and I know you're strong enough to resist. I respect that. I'm impressed, really, and I hope that when he comes for me, I'll be able to resist half as long as you have. It would help a lot if you decided to soulbind with me." Agahara managed a contorted sneer and spat. "Never." Braxton slapped her. "Save your energy, princess. I wasn't talking to you." He looked into her eyes, looked through her eyes, and into the soul behind them. "My brother and I were raised by a fortune teller. She claimed she could communicate with the spirit world, and maybe she really could. With her dying breath, she told me and Orcael that we were descendants from the Sangrook clan, that we were the heirs to the Sangrook pact, dark masters of the fell forest. But the pact was spread thin, weak, diluted. Orcael made it his mission to consolidate that power, and I helped. He's my brother, after all, and we thought that if we could make him strong enough, we could take back everything that once belonged to our family." Agahara's breathing slowed, and her eyes grew cloudy. She was dying. Or was the demon inside focused on his words? "They say that the Sangrook family is cursed, that our every endeavor ends in death. Orcael has embraced that belief. Look at Agahara's brother. We could have ransomed him or used him as a thrall, but Orcael killed young Kammerer when he was already subdued. It's not about restoring family anymore. It's about, well, about this." Braxton gestured towards the death and dismemberment adorning the dungeon. "He enjoys the hunt and the killing too much. A king's son is a valuable thing, and yet my brother saw him as expendable because he wasn't a Sangrook heir. We've done the research, and he wasn't on the list. We've crossed off a few names over the years, but you're the biggest challenge for us so far. You're strong. You've resisted. It could be you talking to me if Agahara had learned who you are and gotten a head start. But what do you think will happen when she succumbs to her wounds? She probably won't last the night, and then you'll fracture, and all us Sangrooks will become a little bit stronger. Or you can soulbind with me, and we'll both double our strength. Then we can do what Orcael won't. We'll take back the family legacy." Agahara hung limply from her manacles, her chest heaving and her one good leg shaking, her neck spasmed and her head drooped. She had either lost consciousness or the demon inside had taken control. It didn't matter which. Braxton pulled the Kammerer sword from his belt and sliced a gash across the palm of his left hand. He pressed the gut against Agahara's chest above the heart, letting his own blood seep into her wounds, into the incantations carved onto her chest. He chanted the words of soul binding. "Your blood to my heart, your heart to my will. Your will to my soul, your soul to my blood, your blood to my heart." He chanted the words over and over, feeling her blood flow into his veins, feeling his own heart commanding hers. There was no resistance, no contest of wills. Her fragment of the pact had agreed to join him. His blood poured into her, linking their minds. If he stopped now, he'd retain the ability to read her thoughts and plant suggestions at his leisure. But he pressed on. His blood poured into hers, taking command of her magical faculties. If he stopped now, he retained the ability to use her as a vessel for his own magical strength. but he pressed on. His blood poured into her, wiping clean her own thoughts and desires and placing them with his own. She was a thrall now, an extension of his will, with no more independence than his own left hand. Princess Marie Kammerer belonged to Braxam now, completely. For a moment, Agahar's wounds glowed in an earthly crimson. Then the gash on Braxam's hand closed and it was over. Braxam panted Agahara on the cheek. She stared back at him blankly, her eyes empty and drool dripping from her mouth to dilute the blood on her chest. That was easy enough, Princess. I was hoping he'd be reasonable. I do apologize if this has been painful. He pulled on the strings of her soul and sucked all the strength of the pact from her, then let the slightest bit trickle back into the shell of her being, still under his control. The irony of it all is that you've received a bit of training. You could have healed yourself, broken your chains, and walked away while my brother and I were asleep. I suggest you take the magic left inside you and heal yourself. I'll find a use for you tomorrow. He psionically commanded her bones to mend and her flesh to close, then ascended the staircase.
Now that the soul binding is complete, where will Braxam take the Sangrook clan? The Sangrook Saga is available on Amazon. Remember to leave a review for this story and all of the stories you read when you finish. Any review left for this story at acnbooks.com/indie-beginning will be featured on next week's episode, or you can just comment below where you found the podcast. You can also help the Indie Beginning podcast by leaving a 5-star review for us on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, or wherever you listen to shows. Reviews are so important for any project. They promote the show and help us bring you the best content possible. Tune in next week when we talk to indie author Steve Thomas about his story, The Line Between Fantasy and Horror, using short stories as a basis for a novel, and much, much more. Indie Beginning is an ACM Books production. All readings in this episode were performed by Marie Kammerer Franke with the permission of the author. All production and editing was done by myself. I am your host, Benjamin Franke, asking everyone to read more books, be the best possible you, and to simply enjoy this wonderful life. Thanks for listening.